Thank you very much, and thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me here. It's been great to be immersed in the world of beakers for a few days. I'm going to try not to repeat too much things other people have said over the last few days. Obviously, coming in the last session, an awful lot of relevant issues have already been discussed, but I will inevitably touch on a few of these sort of key things again. What I want to do is, I'm not going to talk about DNA in any depth, despite the theme of this particular session, because we have a number of papers coming later which are going to do that. So I'm kind of going to take the results of the DNA evidence, particularly the Olalde et al. Paper, pretty much at face value. We can maybe discuss some of that later. But I want to focus really on the archaeological implications of this genetic transformation. And I want to talk about essentially three things. Firstly, just a very brief review of what we mean by this genetic transformation, and particularly to just, I guess, reinforce the sense of scale that we're talking about. Then I want to move on to looking at some of the mechanisms that we might consider, thinking about how this was able to happen, what facilitated genetic change on the scale that we see in Britain, which is quite unlike really what we see anywhere else in Europe. And then maybe picking up on some of the themes that Mike talked about a couple of days ago, look at some of the continuities and some of the complexities that we see in the sense that this, of course, is a genetic transformation, but in terms of a cultural transformation, things are much more complex. Okay, so first, I'll just sort of go back over some of the basics, I guess. So in Britain, there's of course been well over a century of debate around the nature of the Beaker Complex, and it really sort of, I suppose, resolved itself into two sort of binary explanations for a time. Classically, the idea that there was a migratory component to the arrival of Beaker Complex in Britain. Was facilitated not only by the kind of stark break in material culture that was apparent to antiquarian excavators in places like East Yorkshire and elsewhere, but also by the change in cranial shape that was picked up, the change from long-headed Neolithic people to round-headed Beaker people, which fed into the kind of racial theories of the time, and really made that kind of focal point on which to hang a lot of ideas about invasion. And then when we come into the 1960s, at that time, I should say, I suppose, in that sort of antiquarian period and coming through the first half of the 20th century, that notion of migrations, invasions, colonizations by different racially defined groups was commonplace across not just the Beaker period, but essentially the whole of British prehistory. And that kind of comes to an end in the 1960s. In particular, marker point is Graham Clark's paper, The Invasion Hypothesis in British Archaeology. Well, very interestingly, the Beaker complex, the Beaker phenomenon, is essentially the one invasion that survives that re-evaluation because of what was seen to be the kind of weight of evidence that was very hard to argue against. But nonetheless, there were the sort of counter-arguments around pots not equaling people, that the Beaker phenomenon arrives through the spread of ideas, maybe a small migratory component, but essentially it's ideas, new cultural norms, new cosmologies, new cultural perceptions entering into Britain during this period, centered around the attractiveness of new forms of elite display, for example, possibly involving new alcoholic beverages, possibly associated with the attractions of and the sort of perception of metalworking, and of course the spread of cults, religions, cosmologies, whatever we want to call them, whatever we think is appropriate to call these sorts of ideas in these cultures of this period. And this debate, of course, was bouncing back and forth to a large extent over a century or so. From about the middle of the last decade, with advances in genome-wide ancient DNA analysis, it became possible, of course, to investigate this question absolutely directly and to investigate it at the population scale through the analysis of individuals who, of course, are not just telling you about the genetics of that particular individual, but every individual is essentially a population in miniature. They are telling you about their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. So it opened up a huge range of potential avenues and the possibility of actually resolving this question of the migratory component of the Beaker phenomenon in Britain once and for all. As I said, I'm not going to talk through any of the DNA stuff in any detail, but just essentially a whole series of things came together at kind of the right time in the last decade. Advances in capture methods, advances in the analytical methods and statistical processing of the data, and crucially also the recognition of DNA survival in specific parts of the human body, particularly in the petrous and the molars to a lesser extent, and of course now ossicles are the hot thing to get. Okay, so really the crucial turning point for as far as Britain was concerned was the Olalde et al. Paper, 2008, which contained genome-wide data from around about 400 individuals between the Neolithic and the Middle Bronze Age, of whom just over 200 were Beaker individuals. And really the results of this paper, the results of this work sort of divide themselves really quite sharply into two, because the results for continental Europe as a whole and the results for Britain presented two quite radically distinct visions of what population movement was involved in this period. This is just the Beaker sample locations overlaid on another version of the colourful map that you've seen many times. I'm not going to talk about continental Europe, just so that's going to be dealt with in other papers. But at a very basic level, the results were that Beaker individuals in Iberia derived most of their ancestry from local Neolithic farming groups, whereas in Central Europe, the genetic profile, as you've heard, is actually very different. Central European Beaker users in large measure have high levels of steppe-related ancestry, deriving ultimately from the Eurasian steppe, from the Yamnaya or their neighbours in that kind of region. So the crucial thing is that, if you like, people using Beakers in Iberia are not genetically the same as people using Beakers in Central Europe. And you can demonstrate that in all kinds of ways. The Y chromosome lineages common in Iberia, for example, are ones that have been common since the start of the Neolithic, whereas the Y chromosome dominant lineages in Central Europe are different and derived from the steppe. So at a very, very basic level, the continental European Beaker complex, in that sense, relates as much, if not more, to the spread of ideas and concepts and cosmologies than the spread of people. People are moving, of course they're moving, but the spread of the Beaker phenomenon doesn't seem to be completely pinned on to those population movements. There's something else going on too. Now you've seen, I'm afraid you're going to see this a bit more as well. You've seen this image a few times already. In Britain, the picture was entirely different. Just over 50 Neolithic individuals were analysed as part of this project, and all of them lack any indication of steppe-related ancestry, whereas when we come into the individuals associated with Beaker, the Beaker phenomenon, of whom we had about, I think, 37 in this paper, they're displaying large amounts of steppe-related ancestry. So there's a very sharp divide. Interestingly, and I'll come back to it, you can see there's a little gap on the image between the Neolithic and the Beaker individuals, and that relates to a huge problem of sourcing inhumations from the late Neolithic, the later part of the Neolithic in Britain. So that's an issue. There's a gap at a crucial point in there. But importantly, when we look at early Middle Bronze Age individuals in Britain, they also display large amounts of steppe-related ancestry. So that Neolithic dominance, those populations that had a dominant Neolithic ancestry never reappear. They're not emerging from the forests sometime in the Middle Bronze Age. There seems to be a homogenization of the genetic structure of the population by sometime around 2100, maybe 2200 BC. Everybody's pretty much got, broadly speaking, the same sort of genetic profile. This is now this could be substantially updated now based on new samples that we have from Britain, from the Comios project and others. But the basic picture is the same, although there are one or two individuals who make us think again, and I'll come back to those a little bit later. In terms of what this new population, if you like, involved, more than 90% of Beaker and later individuals have the R1b Y chromosome, and a clear indicator of step-related ancestry that's common in Central Europe. So we know that substantial numbers of men, or substantial proportions of men, I'll come back to numbers later, are arriving from the continent. But similarly, we also have new mitochondrial haplogroups showing that this is not some sort of male warrior invasion necessarily. And at the level of the whole genome, we're looking at around about a 93% genetic turnover. So whether or not this is a massive migration, it's certainly a massive genetic transformation, and that is probably a better way to think of it, rather than immediately to jump to the idea of migration. And in terms of the individual, a nice way of thinking of it is that if you are living in the British Isles around 2000 BC, then 93% of your ancestors from 500 years earlier essentially were living in continental Europe. So that's the kind of scale of what we're talking about here. Now, let me get into the problems. There are obviously a whole series of problems, and many of these were objections raised at the time, particularly in Britain, I think, to the initial results of that study. The first one is, and it's been mentioned before, the potential for sampling bias. Classic Beaker burials, classic Beaker burials are highly archaeologically visible in a way that later Neolithic funerary practices in Britain are not. Therefore, there's the suggestion that those, particularly these early individuals with step-related ancestry, are basically, because we're cherry-picking cases for sampling, who are much more likely to be migrants than the general population are. So that raises the question of was population turnover related to a relatively small number of perhaps high-status incomers? That doesn't really stand up as a problem with the study overall, because of that overwhelming dominance of step-related ancestry later, that subsequent Bronze Age genetic structure, which shows that clearly step-related ancestry clearly takes over, and that Neolithic ancestry never really re-emerges, it never really comes back. But it is a problem when we're thinking about the first couple of centuries, when it's in fact almost certainly true that we are oversampling individuals most likely to be related to this new phenomenon, because other people are not being buried in archaeologically recognizable ways, or if they are, it's cremation, which of course is out of our hands in terms of trying to understand any sort of genetic structure. So the sampling bias is clearly going to affect that initial couple of hundred years at least before things homogenize. Anyway, so this I guess resolved that basic question that I've been going for 100 or so years about the role of new populations in the Beaker period. Ray and Thomas described it as a bombshell thrown into the ongoing debates around Beaker origins. It certainly requires us to rethink and actually think about some new questions that we hadn't really thought about before, and I'll come on to some of those later. So that's the broad picture then of what was happening in Britain over that period. And I want to consider now just some of the issues around how that transformation might have happened, what it might have actually meant in human terms, in cultural terms. First thing to think about, I guess, is where is this step-related ancestry coming from? Where are the source areas? And so far, at least, the DNA data is not really in a position to tell us that for a number of reasons. I mean, one of which is the clear and obvious geographical gaps in the continental European data set, beginning to be filled in now a little bit, I think, but certainly in terms of this analysis, big areas that we're lacking. So we're inevitably drawn to particular regions. The steppe-related ancestry coming into Britain is very much, most clearly genetically related to the cluster of individuals that were sampled in the Lower Rhine area, particularly to the early Bronze Age Ostwald population. But they're a little bit later. They're early Bronze Age. They're not source population. Source population we don't have. But broadly, that Lower Rhine area is certainly highlighted as one of the key zones for the introduction of the Beaker phenomenon into Britain. But it isn't as simple as that. It's not as simple and straightforward as one input of new genetic background, genetic ancestry from one specific region. And one way that we can tell that is going back to the poster boy of the Beaker period in Britain, the Amesbury Archer, who I think is cropped up in 4 or 5 talks already in various forms, and is an ongoing source of delight and information really in this period. So the Amesbury Archer then, one of our earliest Beaker burials. He, dies around 35 to 45. Classic Beaker burial, although actually, unrepresentative in the sense that it's so rich. It's unusual in that respect. But he's got all the stuff, all the bling, wide range, large number of grave goods. Andrew Fitzpatrick has suggested that he may be an early metal worker. He's equipped with some of the necessary kit. And of course, before any DNA work on this period at all, the Amesbury Archer was already very significant in these debates around the beginnings of the Beaker period in Britain because of the isotope analysis that had been done on his teeth, and particularly the oxygen isotope analysis of his second and third molars, which would cover the periods of his life, the early part of his life, so between 3 to 6 years old and 9 to 13 roughly, respectively. And the important thing about this analysis was that it clearly showed that during that period of his life, the Amesbury Archer had lived outside Britain. So he was, in that sense, almost certainly a first-generation immigrant. He was almost certainly born to a family who were living outside Britain and had moved sometime after during or after his teenage years. Combination of the isotopes and the archaeology point to the Western Alpine region as the most likely area where he would have come from. So far, so good. During the Alaudi study, it wasn't possible to get a successful sample from this individual. But in this later paper, Patterson et al., which has also been mentioned a couple of times, it was possible to generate usable DNA. And that showed, unsurprisingly, that he was part of the R1b haplogroup. So he's got paternal steppe ancestry. But actually, the Amesbury Archer is a clear genetic outlier for those early Beaker individuals in Britain. He's got very high, for that period, early European farmer ancestry, around about 45%, which suggests that he's deriving from a population that is very mixed in terms of its genetic background and is not likely to be the sort of classic lower Rhine type steppe ancestry that we've seen with other individuals. The important thing about this really is that combining the isotopes and the DNA, we can see that the early European farmer component of the Amesbury Archer's ancestry is deriving from outside Britain. And that makes us have to think again about the nature of the non-steppe ancestry component of some of these other early individuals. They're not all necessarily coming from the indigenous Neolithic population of Britain. Much of that ancestry may be coming in from other areas too, and that 93% may actually be quite a conservative figure in the end. But at the very least, we can see from the Amesbury Archer that we're looking at multiple populations feeding in to that early transition to the Beaker using period. It's not a one event, it's not from one source to another. It's part, of course, as we should expect, of a complex set of regional systems that are funneling people effectively into Britain in this period. Buried next to the archer was the so-called companion, a younger male with more modest grave goods, but very similar ear ornaments, similar but less flashy kit, essentially. And this individual actually shared a congenital tarsal condition with the archer. So there was an expectation that he would be a close biological relative. He may be, but he's not first to third degree relative, but so he's probably slightly less related than that. And his isotope profile, again, covering the same period of life, showed that he was much more likely to have been born in Britain, in the Wessex area. But his third molar is consistent with the Amesbury archer, suggesting that he was born in Britain, but spent part of his later childhood outside, maybe in the communities from which the Amesbury archer derives. And he has, across the genome, typical step-related ancestry for the period. So what we're seeing then is migration into Britain in the mid to late third millennium BC is complex. It's coming from multiple routes, and individual family structures, if you like, individual kinship groups are themselves complex, with considerable mobility, including cross-channel mobility. So the idea that migration can map straightforwardly onto genetics for this period is already, as we'd expect, I think, being shown to be a little simplistic. It's more complicated than that. Okay, so some of that early European farmer ancestry in the Alaldi et al. Paper that we're seeing in this image is probably reflecting migration from other parts of Europe. Okay, I mean, it's pretty clear, and we all know, I think, that genetic identity does not, of course, equal ethnic identity, and the Amesbury archer and the companion are a very good indication of that. But there's a broader kind of context to that as well, I think, which is that the earliest individuals in Britain that we see with step-related ancestry are all, as you've seen, associated with the Beaker Complex. Well, the question is, does that really reflect a Beaker migration? Are these two things absolutely entwined and together, the idea of step ancestry and the use of Beakers with these people coming into Britain? We've seen, of course, that on the continent, there's no consistent connection between Beakers and genetic change. So this was something that myself and David Reich considered in a paper we published a year or so ago, trying to think through some of the issues related to this. And we suggested two potential models, one of which was the sort of, the traditional thing that we might immediately think of, that we're seeing step-related ancestry introduced to Britain by Beaker-using migrants over couple of centuries at most, let's say 2450 to 2100 BC. But the other possibility, and if you think back to that gap in the image, the gap between the late Neolithic and the Chalcolithic individuals, also suggests that we should be open at least to the idea of a slightly gentler model, I guess, of step drift, as we called it, that step-related ancestry is coming to Britain, essentially as an extension of that general westwards movement that we see continent-wide, and becomes detectable in Britain only with the emergence of highly visible Beaker burials. Against the idea of a straightforward Beaker migration, stroke invasion, stroke colonization, is that, as Mike, I think, highlighted, we've got very little evidence for conflict in this period. We don't have any mass graves. We don't have anything we could think of as a battle site. No increase in the incidence of violent injury, and in fact, if anything, a decrease, because we've got lots of good evidence for interpersonal conflict in the early Neolithic. But really very little at all in the Beaker period. So if anything, it seems to go down. So none of that is suggesting a clash of cultures or anything on that sort of scale that the newspapers would like us to have. So maybe we have to think that, well, if that's the case, was the indigenous population of Britain already so low that large numbers of people could be accommodated without any substantial conflict? Well, that's another possibility. But those are things we have to think about if we adhere to this kind of model. The step drift idea is I guess relates a little more to Martin's ideas of looking polythetically at this issue. And that's seeing what we see in Britain essentially as the result of a collision of two essentially independent, intertwined, but essentially independent processes. A cultural process of the spread and adoption of beakers and beaker-related culture, and a genetic process, which is the progressive movement across Europe of communities with high levels of steppe-related ancestry. And as I said, the key issue here really for us is the lack of evidence that we have for what's happening to the dead in the late Neolithic. We do have cremations from a significant number of sites. We have very few inhumations, really a few individuals from the Arcadian chamber tombs that we can date to around 2600, 2700, but beyond that, really very little at all. And it raises the question that if steppe ancestry arrived before the arrival of beakers, would we actually be in a position to detect it in those crucial couple of centuries? And, we wouldn't at the moment. Okay, so where are what's going on with this indigenous population? What's going on with this late Neolithic people? We clearly have geographical gaps in the sampling of beaker burials in Britain, and there are, in any case, geographical gaps in the distribution of beaker burials in Britain. So did indigenous communities simply carry on in those areas that we happen not to have covered by sampling? That's a possibility. It's probably almost certainly true in some cases. Have indigenous groups been missed due to cremation or otherwise invisible funerary rites? That too is more likely than not to be true in some or many cases. And Inigo Alalde has shown in Iberia, for example, that distinct populations with and without steppe-related ancestry can exist side by side within the same region for over a period of several centuries. So it's not an impossible idea that we have some sort of parallel development of two separate groups. But there are indications that, and I think you've seen this image previously too, there are indications that actually that late Neolithic population was undergoing stress and reduction in the period, the centuries leading up to the appearance of the Beaker Complex in Britain. So if only 7% or so of the later genetic inheritance comes from these people, why is that the case? What are the factors impinging on that? Again, well before DNA arrived on the scene, there was already a strong suggestion that population levels, human activity levels in general in Britain were decreasing significantly in the later part of the Neolithic. And this is the Stevens and Fuller image that's basically showing summed probability distribution of radiocarbon dates from, on the top, cereal grains, and on the bottom from wild resources, hazelnut shells and so on. And you see this, of course, major early Neolithic boom and bust, if you like, and then a significant decline to a point around about 2800 or so, where there's really very little visible agriculture happening at all in Britain over that period from this sort of analysis. When things start to pick up again, of course, it's exactly the date at which we see the first arrival of the Beaker Complex in Britain, around about 2450 BC. We see this, not immediate massive jump, but we see a pickup that then over the succeeding centuries to about 2000 BC reaches another peak. Interestingly, indications maybe of another little boom and bust in there with the Beaker using communities, but I won't go into that now. And we can see this on, that's on a general UK-wide scale, but we can see it on individual sites, in individual catchment areas as well. I've just picked this site because I excavated it. It's a site in the Western Isles of Scotland called Ellendonnell. It's a little, not a settlement site actually, but it's a site that was used by early farmers in the middle of a loch with a causeway leading out to it. And environmental analysis of the waterlogged remains from this site has shown that it was established around 3750 BC and occupied up until about 2800, so it's very long-lived. But really quite early in the sequence, from about 3600, we see overexploitation of the catchment, lots of sediment running into the loch, the stripping of turf for construction and fuel. We see soil exhaustion, soil erosion, the establishment of peat around the catchment. So essentially, from a broad scale picture, these people are arriving, farming too heavily, and essentially destroying that landscape that's supporting them over a period of a few centuries, and have gone by 2,800. And almost in microcosm, that is a sense of what we're seeing in many parts of Britain over this period. We also have to think, of course, about a declining population, maybe. As you've heard from Mike's paper, a population who are remarkably isolated from Europe over the period of the late Neolithic. So we have to also assume a degree of increasing genetic isolation over that period. So a declining population, a genetically rather isolated population. There is always a possibility, of course, that they are less resistant to new forms of disease which are emerging in this period of population movement across Europe. So we're starting to hear a lot more now about new zoonotic diseases, especially Yersinia pestis. Recent paper by Sikora et al. Is tracking this essentially across Europe, and it appears to be on the move, very much associated with these population changes that we're seeing in this period. It doesn't originate in this period. There actually are, the earliest British example so far is from Orkney, 2,800, so it does exist in the late Neolithic period, and we've got a couple of examples from around 2000 BC. So we're only in the very early stages of getting a sense of the role of Yersinia pestis over this period, but it wouldn't be a great surprise if steppe pastoralists have developed a greater level of immunity or tolerance to these kinds of zoonotic diseases, which is not present in the British population at that time. So we have the possibility then that plague effectively reduces an already depleted, already somewhat struggling late Neolithic population. So these are all factors to do with what's happening in the late Neolithic. Thinking about the dynamics, so we still got somehow or other to get to a 90% or greater genetic transformation. So how do we start to think about that? What does it mean in terms of numbers of people coming in and so on? And you can model it in all kinds of different ways. And the crucial variables really are the numbers of people relative to the existing population who are coming in. How many people are coming in relative to how many people are already there? How long are they taking to come in? Is it over a few years? Is it decades? Is it over centuries? And what level of segregation is there between newly arriving communities and existing communities? So have we got segregated or mixed communities in this period? And this is very simple back of an envelope stuff, but just to give a sense, I think Martin already showed a slightly more sophisticated version of this. But if you just think about two populations, a Neolithic and a Beaker population, and let's say at 2400 BC, let's say there's 100 of population 1 and 100 of population 2. If there's an average female reproductive rate of 1.8 surviving children amongst the Neolithic population, so that's sort of the population reproducing itself at 0.9, and higher rate 2.2 in the Beaker population, that's not a huge difference really, but over 12 generations, those equal numbers have gone to 28 versus 313. So they've gone from 50-50 to 92%, 8%. So in that sense, it doesn't take a massive proportion of additional people to make those changes happen. And in fact, of course, you can do this with any set of numbers. But even if you assume a much smaller migrant population, let's say only a tenth of the size of the Neolithic population, but let's say that Neolithic population is under more stress, maybe it's that there's more disease, maybe there's more farming disasters happening, and that Beaker population is expanding merrily into new areas of Britain and producing lots of surviving children, then even with a 10% influx of people, you can still reach the sort of figures we see here over 12 generations or so. The jury is very much still out on the nature of that population movement. It could be a relative trickle of people. It all depends on what happens essentially when they get there. Also, it's fair to say that those kinds of projections ignore population mixing. They assume unrealistically complete segregation of these two populations. And that's something that we simply don't know as yet, to what extent these populations were interacting with each other, reproducing with each other, and so on. Interestingly, we still see individuals with more or less complete step-related ancestry coming in relatively late in the sequence, a good few centuries after it begins. But there does seem to be a change around about, let's say, 2100, 2200, when we stop seeing those individuals coming in. We see this much higher level of homogenization, which coincides more or less accurately, I guess, with Needham's idea of a fishing horizon, where you have a much greater kind of insularity in the development of pottery, for example, more local styles appearing across Britain. So a sense that something is changing again in that period. The isotope work that Mike and others have done has obviously shown high levels of mobility within Britain. With isotopes, it's needle in a haystack stuff really to pick up first-generation migrants. It's amazing that we have any at all, but the isotopes are showing clearly lifetime mobility. And that, I wonder if that is related to the ability of this new population to expand. So exploitation of new or revived environmental niches, an expansion of pastoralism in this period, rapid population expansion, maybe with the rapid fissioning of mobile groups into what is essentially an underpopulated landscape. And in support of that, we could suggest, the lack of big clusters of Beaker burials. It tends to be one here, one there. You get a sense of these communities as being quite fluid, very mobile in that sense, and lacking kind of stable hierarchies that are effective in one particular place over a long period of time. The lack of substantial houses is another potential factor in that. So this idea of a population that's moving in, finding new niches, expanding, fissioning, would play into those kind of ideas about how that genetic transformation may act itself out. So just to summarize all that, factors that we have to think about as combining to create this genetic transformation: potentially a relatively small, declining late Neolithic population, maybe differential resistance to zoonotic infectious disease, partial segregation, maybe more, possibly due to different economic practices, different cosmological structures, mobility, fissioning, and opportunities for expansion for new communities, and also possibly continuing input of small numbers of new individuals coming over from the continent, chain migration perhaps related to kinship networks. Okay, I just want to finish up by fairly briefly talking about some of the continuities and complexities that we see in this period. I'm not going to go in any depth into things like the Stonehenge landscape. Mike's really effectively shown how difficult it is to relate those very detailed chronologies clearly to the new population. There's clearly a continuity to a degree, an adoption of pre-existing ritual landscapes, even these huge ones that are so associated and must have always been so tied up with those late Neolithic communities, those late Neolithic cosmologies. But we do see little hints, and Mike has flagged them up, of cosmological tweaking, if you like, even to sites like Stonehenge itself, with the reorganization of elements of the site to perhaps accommodate new ideas and new forms of belief. But I just wanted to show that it's not just these big ritual landscapes that we're so familiar with that are adopted by Beaker-using people. Another area where I've been doing excavation, is a remote series of sea caves, the Cowsey Caves in northeast Scotland, where we have a site that's extremely remote, difficult to access. It's not at all Stonehenge-y, but we have practices of funerary deposition from the early Neolithic through to the late Bronze Age. And we have individuals, disarticulated, commingled individuals within these caves from around about 2,300 or so, and immediately they all have step-related ancestry when we've done the genetic analyses of these. And we also have fragments of Beaker pottery from the caves themselves. So again, here, even something that would appear to be a kind of a niche funerary landscape associated probably with a relatively small community in the late Neolithic period is enthusiastically adopted and appropriated by these new populations. And this area of northeast Scotland, of course, is one of the core areas of early Beaker presence in Britain. We also have the sort of appropriation, co-option of earlier monumental forms in western parts of Britain, northern and western parts of Britain. We have lots of evidence for Atlantic rock art, part of these broader Atlantic traditions. And in the early Bronze Age, we see essentially people going out and cutting out panels of this rock art to be incorporated into single graves in the early Bronze Age. So again, that idea of appropriating and co-opting what's already out there in this ritual landscape that essentially belonged to a genetically distinct earlier population. I think we're at the point now where we really need to start burrowing into the regional detail of some of these changes. There was a really important paper recently by Dulias et al., 2022, looking at Orkney, for example, where they were doing genome-wide analysis of Middle Bronze Age populations primarily. And you could see the dominance of step-related ancestry there, as we would expect, but Y chromosome continuity from the Neolithic. So in other words, step-related ancestry coming into Orkney primarily through the maternal side, presumably through patrilocal marriage patterns, linking communities in Orkney to communities in mainland Scotland, but with the maintenance, this preservation of indigenous male lineages, at least until the mid-first millennium BC. So, you know, a really quite different picture that deserves a lot more detailed research. In the Western Isles, for example, so just moving around to another part of Scotland, we see a completely different picture, a picture that's much more like the situation in Ireland that Neil was describing, in fact, where we see from a pretty early stage, Beaker pottery, burials and settlements, the use of one of the few areas in Britain where we have decent Beaker houses, and a regionally distinct but recognisably Beaker culture from the start of the Bronze Age, essentially. So just to conclude, there's no doubt about this massive genetic turnover between the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, something like a 93% genetic transformation. But clearly, this is a starting point for our analysis, it may be the end of one old debate, but it's really the start of a whole multiplicity of new ones. We need to think about the duration, the mechanisms of this genetic transformation. We need to think about differential resistance to disease, agricultural failure, differential reproductive success, and crucially, regionally variable trajectories. We shouldn't think of Britain, continental Europe in this sort of binary way, I guess. And something that I think we haven't even as archaeologists really begun to address yet, which is what this new world essentially was meant for these people moving into this new region, creating essentially new social worlds, creating essentially new ways of being, using what they find in the landscape in terms of these pre-existing ritual and funerary sites. And I think we've got ways of looking into all of these things. More and denser sampling on regionally defined groups, the promise of IBD to start to tell us more about population sizes, population dynamics, I think in 5-10 years' time we'll be a great deal closer to answering some of these questions. Thank you very much.